What's up, Story Geeks, and thank you for joining us today on the Story Geeks YouTube channel for our discussion on storytelling within the Star Wars and Marvel Cinematic Universe. I'm Tim Wozni, and today I'm going to be joined by Jay Shear, Amazon best-selling author of the book Timeslingers. When Jay and I sat down to have this discussion, we did so in anticipation of the premiere of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier and the return of The Mandalorian for its second season this fall. Unfortunately, as a result of the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, the release of The Falcon and the Winter Soldier has been postponed until filming can safely resume. This is a huge disappointment for everyone, especially for those who have poured their heart and soul into this project. We look forward to continuing this conversation in the future, and we know that you'll join us in wishing them all the best. For now, we invite you to sit back, relax, and join us in the conversation by posting in the comment section below. And thanks for listening in. The Story Geeks YouTube channel is produced by the Reclamation Society. Make sure that you subscribe for more in-depth perspectives on geek content. Enjoy.
Just to dive right in, let's continue on with last week's thread and start by looking at Star Wars. Where do we see successes in the narrative continuity? And where do we see some gaps that may have let the fan base down?
Yeah, it's a really good question. As you look at like this broader storytelling perspective, this new franchise model that's becoming so popular, especially because of streaming services, it is a really good question to ask, like from a storytelling perspective as story geeks, where are people getting it right and where are people maybe getting it wrong? And a lot of times I'm glad you're asking this question, Tim, because a lot of times when you log into an online discussion, it's purely a subjective like I like this or I like that and I don't like this other thing. But I like, as a storyteller, I like digging into like, well, why? Why are these things consistent? Why are they inconsistent? Continuity has been all over the place in Star Wars to a certain degree. It's not like to do it in an awful way, but some of the successes, like you asked, I think Rogue One is a huge success. I think Rogue One fills in a gap. I obviously, when Rogue One was announced, I was like, do I even want that story? But like, having received Rogue One, it's my second favorite or third favorite Star Wars thing behind The Mandalorian and Empire Strikes Back. And so I think it's really good. It keeps the narrative consistency and does it really well. The Clone Wars, I think, is really good at this too. Like the Clone Wars, Dave Filoni, and I think, obviously Dave was George Lucas's right-hand person in many regards at the close of his tenure as the leader of Star Wars. But he does a great job, Dave Filoni does, with managing Star Wars and the mythology around Star Wars throughout the Clone Wars series. They add some pretty weird things in at times, which I think they don't break continuity, but they definitely break. They definitely lean towards some of the Eastern mysticism parts of the Force, even more so than the movies do. But I think that just kind of expands the mythology and makes it kind of more interesting. As far as gaps go, I think that the sequel trilogy definitely has some continuity issues in it. I am a fan of the sequel trilogy. I like the sequel trilogy better than I like the prequel trilogy. So I don't want people to think that I am subjectively saying that I dislike something. I'm just saying from a continuity perspective, I think there's some problems with continuity there. But I also think that there's continuity issues in the prequel trilogy. The Chosen One prophecy adds a lot of weirdness to Star Wars that is never ultimately resolved in any way, shape, or form that I've seen yet. And I even think that there are things in the original trilogy, the reference to parsecs, and the parsec being what sounds like a time or element, which is then referred back to as, no, it's a distance element. I mean, so there's like little continuity here and there. But I do think that there are some pretty controversial aspects to the franchise storytelling gaps. And I think we'll probably talk about those in some of the other questions you've got here. But that's kind of my take really quickly. Like there's continuity issues all over the place to a certain degree.
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly second Rogue One. It feels exactly like the start of A New Hope.
Yeah.
And I mean, you have all of like a 30-second continuity gap between the end of Rogue One and the start of A New Hope, which helps, right. But they nailed the setting and the vibe of it to such a huge degree. And I remember since literally within an hour of it being announced, or at least teased at Comic-Con a few years back, I have been hyped because what they did at Comic-Con, and ended up changing a little bit, was a largely still image. I mean, like trees waving and whatnot. A largely still image of the Death Star over Endor, if I remember right. And like I say, the timeline of this story changed a little bit, and it was just rebel radio chatter of things going wrong.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool.
And so everyone was like, "What is this? This is crazy!" Like the first hard, edgy Star Wars film. So that's one that I really, really like and have held onto from right at the very, very start. Clone Wars covers a lot of content, but keeps it really locked into a certain. And yeah, you have weird arcs like the Altar of Mortis arc.
Right, exactly. That's one of the ones I was thinking of.
Really dive into some of the flowy and hard to nail down aspects of the Force, which I think is sort of where Rian Johnson was trying to go in Last Jedi. There are gaps in the OT, like you said. Where do they go from? How do they get from destroying the Death Star to hiding on Hoth? Like, how do they go from such a high to sort of a low so quickly? Right. There are definitely some time gaps. It's like 10 years, right, between Phantom Menace and Clone Wars, where you miss a lot. And there are a couple expanded universe books that cover that. And I think looking at the sequel trilogy, and I do want to touch a little bit on this again and later with with one of our later questions, but I'm a chronic appreciator, to use one of my professor's language. And I think there are definitely some gaps in the sequel trilogy, but it's very curious to see. Like, I rewatched Rise of Skywalker this week, and I watched it from a standpoint of changing some things in my head, and it's so interesting how little those things, and I'll go back into this in a little bit, how little those things actually change the narrative of Rise of Skywalker, but really change some of the controversial issues of Rise of Skywalker. And so it's interesting how some really little choices that in the immediate sense don't change the narrative can feel world breaking in the big picture.
And that's a common problem. This is why we're gonna talk about the MCU here in a minute, and I think that this is why the MCU, as we move forward, is going to have a lot more challenges, because like introducing time travel opens so many pathways that can be problematic. It's interesting to compare the two, Star Wars and the MCU, for sure.
So MCU is way more fluid than Star Wars. I mean, the main films in Star Wars, with two exceptions, have been locked into trilogies or individual films, and the vast majority of 9 of those 11 films were trilogy films. MCU is way more fluid. There are some trilogies, but where do we see their success, and where does it fail to connect the dots in some places?
I think so. The payoff in Endgame, to me, is amazing, because it basically capitalizes on everything that came before it. So you have this 10 years worth of movies coming before what happens in Endgame, and it basically works all the way through, and all of the things in Endgame work because of what came before it, despite the fact that you have a bunch of individual visions creating individual movies along the way that are contributing to the bigger vision. The fact that that's all connected and guided by Kevin Feige, and I think also Jon Favreau should get a little bit of a shout out from being involved from the very beginning. that's pretty amazing to be able to do that. To be able to take all of these films across a 10-year period and wrap them up in a way that like is just almost too perfect in some ways. I think it's really good. So I think from a franchise storytelling perspective, the MCU is like the ideal situation. I do think that there are some issues. I think that the MCU plays its storylines very safe. It doesn't take any like major detours. There's a very much a formula for making an MCU movie, and pretty much everybody follows that formula. I think if you dig deep enough, the Empire podcast, friends of ours, they have done a lot of conversations about the timeline not being exactly right. So I think that you can criticize the timeline in some ways. I think that they are starting to explore different styles with their storytelling. Obviously, with Captain Marvel, they go into the 90s, and so there's a slightly different style there, although it feels very much like an MCU movie. In many regards, Ragnarok doesn't exactly feel like an MCU movie to me, and yet it does fit into the narrative that they're creating on their way to Endgame. In fact, it's a really important part of the narrative on the way to Endgame, because otherwise we would never see Thor the way that Thor shows up in Endgame. But it's also like a distinctly different kind of style, and I'm not sure that style worked for me in the context of the MCU. I'm a big fan of Taika Waititi, so that's always cool. But and then the last thing where I don't think it works perfectly is that I don't think that all of the TV properties that are connected to the MCU connect all that well. The most striking example of this, because I think like you've got things that fall onto the kind of like too cheesy end, which is in my definition of like what Agents of Shield is. If you can see it very obviously when you see season 1 of Agent Carter versus season 2 of Agent Carter. Season 1 of Agent Carter is one of the best comic book series that's ever been done. But season 2, as you transition into it, is very much feels like network TV at that point. But I will also tell you that the Daredevil, Jessica Jones, Luke Cage, all of those on Netflix feel very stylistically different because it feels like they're a lot darker. They don't feel as connected to the movies. So there are some issues with the franchise there in terms of connectivity. But again, like I said earlier, like the MCU to me is a testament on how to do a franchise well, because what I'm pointing out here are pretty minor issues that didn't cause a lot of division amongst the fandom, whereas Star Wars has had a lot more division. I do think, as I mentioned earlier, that the MCU is setting itself up for bigger challenges. Changing the lead characters and bringing in legacy characters is almost always controversial for various reasons. Bringing time travel into the equation and literally having what seems like series that will be on Disney Plus that are based on those time travel like offshoots is going to cause problems with continuity, perhaps. So, I think it's easy, even in the early days of Star Wars, it's easy when your continuity is all based off sort of like a route plan. But when that plan has to like continue to move through another phase, that's when it can get more difficult. And that's when things can get tripped up a little bit more. Back in the day when we had the original trilogy and then we had like all of the books based off the original trilogy in what are now Legends, there was a lot of connectivity between all of those things. Those things they all kind of worked together. It started to get a little dicier when you added the prequels. And then when you switched the vision and you went from George Lucas's vision to sort of Lucasfilm under Disney's vision, there's a definite shift there as well. So I just think that the more complex your franchise gets, the more difficult it is to make sure that everything is in continuity and that works really well. And I think the MCU is going to start hitting that phase. They might have lucked out, honestly, with the pandemic shutting everything down in Hollywood, because now it's almost like we as a fandom get a reset button to a certain degree. So we're just gonna see how this all plays itself out. But what do you think? What is your opinion?
I think looking at the MCU, you have some not every film has been perfect. Not every
Mm.
film has succeeded. Thor 2 is probably the textbook
Yeah.
example of this. You have some really strong opinions on Iron Man 2 and Iron Man 3 as well. Iron Man 3 is probably the Marvel film that I have seen the least,
Mm.
just from a standpoint of seeing it initially or in theaters. It just sort of didn't do anything for me. It wasn't necessarily good. It wasn't necessarily bad. It was just, eh.
Meh. Yeah.
It was all right. And
Yeah.
I think for the MCU films, that's sort of where Thor 2 also lands in the end. Is it was all right. I liked watching Thor hit things with a hammer.
Yeah.
Um, but it doesn't do much more for me. And that for the MCU, because of how connected it is,
Mm.
not connecting feels like a cardinal sin.
Mm.
You had this opportunity to be a part of a huge story and you just were like, man, nah, don't wanna.
Right.
And like that just feels so counter to what the MCU is doing.
Mm-hmm.
The TV shows sort of fall into this gap. They all feel like they're telling a good story. Um,
Yeah.
I have not finished the Netflix uh, series all the way through.
Mm.
I did not have access to Agent Carter, and I sort of fell out of Agents of Shield. But they all tell a good story, but they never felt like they really connected. They felt parallel.
Yes.
And in the same way, you have an opportunity to be a huge part of it.
Yeah.
Why aren't you?
Right. Exactly.
You have this beautiful golden goose of a franchise, and you take a pass on it, and it's just kind of, it just feels, and because of how connected it is, it feels disjointed. I'm with you on looking really curiously at what's coming next.
Yeah.
Doctor Strange and Black Panther for me are some of the ones that do the best example of being very distinct but still
Yes.
feeling very locked in. They're distinct but essential.
Yes, I agree 100%. That's a really good
They have a
observation.
hugely different voice to them. They have a hugely different narrative to them, but they are so keyed in to the MCU. And the Doctor Strange sequel is going to be the MCU's first foray into the horror genre, with Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. And so there are definitely some major challenges that are coming for the MCU, especially as it looks to keeping that consistent. With Thor: Love and Thunder, you have the return of Natalie Portman and a passing of, not quite a torch, but a passing of a hammer
Right.
to the next generation. And so you have some pretty sizable shifts.
Mm-hmm.
And if they continue on as they have, I think they have it in them to make sure that stays linked and continuous. But they definitely have some challenges that I'm very curious to see them work out.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, I think that's a good observation.
We also know that Star Wars is sort of moving in that direction. Late 2019, early 2020, Kathleen Kennedy announced that Star Wars after Rise of Skywalker is moving away from the 3-act series. They're moving away from distinct trilogies. And more towards the same structure. There are new rumors coming out of more political shifts within Lucasfilm and within Disney to sort of bring that about. But it is essentially the same structure that the MCU is looking at. Do you think that's going to be a positive thing for Star Wars as a franchise, or and sort of does it, beyond the idea of just looking at Star Wars and MCU, does this broad umbrella storytelling sort of signal a shift in just storytelling in general?
Yeah, it's interesting. So first to the trilogy part of the question, and I mean, trilogies are really synonymous with Star Wars because of original trilogy, prequel trilogy, sequel trilogy. I don't know that not doing trilogies is the right solution to the problem that the Star Wars franchise actually has. I don't think the issue is the structure in which you're, because, like, for example, the MCU actually has trilogies embedded in it. Now, it has more than trilogies, but it has trilogies in it. And those trilogies would stand alone as pretty cool films. It's just that there's like almost like spacer films in between some of the major components of the major trilogies. So I think if you were to say we're going to lock ourselves into telling stories in trilogies, that'd be like, well, why would you do that? So by Kathleen Kennedy saying like, we're going to move away from doing trilogies, it just seems to me like that's like the natural progression of saying, well, we need the flexibility to be able to do whatever we want to. But to say like we're going to move away from trilogies as if like you're never going to do another trilogy again seems like it's a little bit short-sighted to me. I don't think that's what she means necessarily. So I think what she's trying to do is send a signal to people that like we're going to move into more of a franchise model, whatever that means in the modern day. I think we know what it means: TV shows and all these things that are interconnected. And we're going to move away from the focus being on the next. Don't look for the next trilogy. Look for the next Star Wars movie. And I think that's probably fine. But I also think that the main issue, like I said, is not trilogies. I think it's actually ideological perspectives on the content. And so, when I look at the sequel trilogy, again, love the sequel trilogy, am invested in the sequel trilogy, like the sequel trilogy a lot. But the problem was, I think JJ and Ryan were actually pushing different interpretations, whether intentionally or unintentionally. I don't think either director had any ill will of doing anything like to ruin Star Wars or change Star Wars or anything. They just were bringing two different distinct perspectives to the table. JJ was trying to be a traditionalist. He was trying to say, well, we know what Star Wars was. Let's pay homage to what Star Wars was. And I think Ryan, in many regards, was being a deconstructionist. Like, we know what Star Wars is, but should it be that 40 years later? Right? Should we change what we know as being Star Wars? We've had all this time pass. And so,
or could it be more? Could it be more than what it is?
Exactly right. Exactly right. So let's deconstruct in order to reconstruct. Is what I think Ryan was kind of trying to go toward. Both of those aspects of storytelling have a place in stories. So neither one of them was doing anything wrong. But the problem, I think, is that Star Wars lacks, and I have a way to solve this, so I'm going to get into that in a minute, but Star Wars lacks a Kevin Feige. Kevin Feige is sitting here going, I have this overall perspective. There's this phase, and then this phase, and then this phase, and then this phase, and you add up all these phases, and it looks like this. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately. About there's a verse in the Bible, which is a really random thing to bring up in this conversation, but it is,
go for it.
Without a vision, the people perish. And obviously, like, I think that that's very instructive to what a vision provides a set of people working towards something. Because if they can see the vision and go like, oh, that's what we're aiming for, it's much easier for them to say, well, I'll take my portion of my responsibility towards achieving that vision, and I'll do it in the best possible way that I can. But if you don't have the vision, it's very difficult for people to weigh in with their perspective without actually seeming like they're trying to change what once was, because there's no vision. So it's kind of hard to do. And so Kathleen Kennedy very distinctly is not trying to be Kevin Feige. And sometimes people will try and put her in that role. They'll try and say something like, well, Kathleen Kennedy isn't getting it right. It's like, well, she's not doing the same thing that Kevin Feige is doing.
Yeah.
And I think it's a mistake to put them in the same places. George Lucas was inherently the Kevin Feige before George Lucas left, because it was his stuff. And so I just think that if I was Lucasfilm personally, I would immediately bring on Dave Filoni as the overarching visionary for the Star Wars franchise and put him in the same role that Kevin Feige has. And I would say that Star Wars is facing really more of a leadership vision problem, not a plotting issue. That's why I bring up the three, like, not doing trilogies and not doing like 3-act type of stuff. To me, that's not the problem. The problem is it's a vision problem. It's a leadership problem. And as soon as that gets solved, the other problem will just fall into alignment, and you could do trilogies if you wanted to, and it would still work.
Well, and looking at George Lucas, sort of in that Kevin Feige position, just sort of as the creator and the author, sort of lines up with J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter and the napkin that she drew on with 7 columns and for each book and all the characters and all these different plot points. They have the overall story in their head. It's their story. They know it. It's intrinsic to them. And how you transfer that out. And maybe this is where comics has a little bit of an advantage in that it's already, when Kevin Feige and like you said, Jon Favreau really sit down, and I think So Random, this is going to address a little bit of what you're saying here, of that MCU is to you tells a bit more of a cohesive story. They're, picking apples and oranges and saying dope smoothie. They're not, it's not, Harry Potter and Star Wars exist in a little bit different of a space where it's one narrative. Yes, it's Star Wars is starting to branch out. Yes, Harry Potter is testing the waters in its own franchising. But with Marvel, they had the opportunity to say, these are some really excellent storylines. And it almost is like they're curating a gallery or curating a museum of content that they can pull from and choose from. And it's exciting to see Star Wars going in that direction. I think there's a lot of room for more short stories to be played out, like Rogue One, like Solo. Although I would say I think there was an intentionality for Solo to not be a singular film. There's clearly hooks that lead to other things. Maybe 2 films would have closed it. Maybe it wouldn't have. But I think there's a lot of space for these short stories in Star Wars where there are characters that we love, and it's in the trilogies, and it's a world that we have all fallen in love with. And there's so much space for good storytelling within that world. And to approach it, I think perhaps more like trying to curate a collection of stories rather than, and I think that is where they're going with this, rather than continuing to tell just primarily the Skywalker saga, is going to open up a lot of doors. The one thing I am a little worried about in that context is it sort of getting the Hobbit treatment. And perhaps trying to stretch too much story into too many movies. And you do have the issue with the Hobbit where most of the 5th movie happens while Bilbo's unconscious in the book. But and there are things in the novel of The Hobbit that don't work on film and had to be translated. But there are some widely popular fan edits of those 3 films that cut it down into 2. And so there's a fairly common question of, did it need 3? Could it have been done in 2? And so I'm that is sort of the one thing that I think Star Wars needs to be careful of as they sort of step into this new mode of storytelling for Star Wars, is that we're giving the stories as little and as much as they need. So that it lands in the right place. And I think so far Rogue One did that for sure. And I think Solo did that, at least with its own individual narrative. It was the right length of film, and it was a relatively short movie as modern cinema goes.
Just really quick too, to pick up on your Hobbit comment.
Absolutely.
Because like that's a really fascinating one to me, because it's playing with a franchise, same visionary person in charge of it, right? So it's an interpretation of an earlier work. So it has all the things that should have been going for it to make it a cohesive franchise across the board. The one thing that it falls into, which is the same thing that George Lucas fell into, is that it actually, notice that Tolkien started with The Hobbit and moved into Lord of the Rings.
Mm,
Jackson did Lord of the Rings and then went back and did The Hobbit, which sort of similar to the original trilogy and the prequel
yeah.
trilogy. And the problem I think that it has is the same problem that the prequel trilogy has in some ways, is that although I will say that Revenge of the Sith is distinctly different in this regard, but you moved from a deeper, somewhat darker, more intense story to a little bit more of a simplistic, meant to be a little bit wider audience,
Hmm.
humorous, not as intense story. And it's almost like you should never move in that direction. You should only move in the other direction, right? Like make the easy to digest story first and then move towards the darker one, as opposed to doing the reverse of that.
Yeah.
Audiences don't seem to. It's almost like I want you to go deeper, not actually rise up and go lighter.
Yeah.
So that's a really good example. I like that you brought that up.
Well, and we're tangenting a little bit, but fine.
Yeah, why not?
uh, Amazon is now producing the Silmarillion. Um,
Yes.
and so it'll be curious because that almost feels like a pendulum swing far in the other direction. I think Hobbit sort of exists as that entry point, right? It was the single original story.
Yep.
Then you have the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which follows on its heels.
Yep.
And then Silmarillion, like, way rewinds
Totally.
and way gets specific.
Yep.
Like, I, as a teenager, was unable to get through all of the Lord of the Rings books. And my understanding, and I think the wide understanding, is that the Silmarillion makes the Lord of the Rings look very linear.
Exactly.
And very simple. So that almost feels like a big swing back in the other direction.
Totally.
Which is sort of what I think the sequel trilogy for Star Wars did, but to look a little bit more at this. And it's a little controversial, but looking at the idea of a headcanon, and changing aspects of the stories in your own minds. What sort of place does headcanon play into these stories that we receive? And does it border the idea of being a little disrespectful or detracting from the original artist's voice and vision?
Yeah. This is a good question, and I think about this oftentimes from a writer's perspective too, because I often think about this as like, well, what am I putting in my stories, and what are people taking from my stories, which is kind of interesting. But so let me answer this in a long-winded way, but I promise I'll get to the actual answer. So the first question I have to ask is, like, in terms of Star Wars specifically, what happened? Like, how did the fandom get so divisive? Like, why were people all of a sudden so angry at each other for liking the same thing? And so what was the problem here? And I mentioned that I think that JJ's vision and Ryan's vision were different for what they were trying to accomplish. Again, JJ was trying to be more traditionalist, so much so that he got accused of being derivative of A New Hope. But then also Ryan got criticized for almost trying to, what I would call, deconstruct what other people might say, ruin the Star Wars mythology by ruining the character of Luke, or even questioning the role of the Jedi, and these things that George Lucas had built up over decades. He started to kind of deconstruct them. But what's behind that problem? Why would we have these two factions fighting in the fandom? And I think that it's related to headcanon. And to me, it's the ideologies that drive the storytelling. So ideology being the perspective that someone wants to bring or wishes was in their favorite fandom, their favorite stories that are being told. And so this is where a headcanon, I think, comes in. And I think that George Lucas basically never went hard in the paint with ideology. He always softened anything that he was putting into his films. With the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, if he was going to have Eastern mysticism, it wasn't so far into Eastern mysticism that other people of other religious or spiritual backgrounds couldn't find themselves in his story. It was pretty mass market appeal in terms of how people could digest what he was saying and take lessons from it. And so especially in the United States American kind of perspective. He, with the prequel trilogy, he basically told a story in the prequel trilogy that was largely about the democracy versus fascism, because we'd seen kind of the elements of fascism in the original trilogy, and so these are things that America has been wrestling with specifically for years and years and years. It's not like he's not like he's like trying to change our perspective on the world.
Yeah.
He's just trying to live into our perspectives on the world. And so I think that JJ, Gareth Edwards, Ron Howard, who knows what the movie Solo would have been before Ron Howard's involvement. But they all tried to copy George. They all tried to go with George's ideals. And all they did was sort of update the facade of it. And what I mean by the facade is that they got more diversity involved from casting perspective. They tried to bring in a few different types of voices, but they weren't changing the Star Wars ideology. And when you see, I think you see it in the books, if you've read any of the new books that are canon. And if you look at what Rian Johnson did, it's actually, you can start to see different ideologies playing with what George Lucas had set up. And they're playing with the ideologies, not just with the facade, right? It's one thing to play with the facade, because if you play with the facade, it's like, well, I'm entering different characters, but they're still furthering the same environment and the same setting and the same world. The world building isn't changing at all. But I think Rian Johnson and some of the people who are writing for the new books and the new comics are actually actively looking at it and questioning the Star Wars mythology. Now, I like deconstructing stories. I personally enjoy that. So for me, this is not like, what are you doing to Star Wars? It's more like, oh, interesting. Let's see what these people want to say about Star Wars, but in a different kind of way. I think George and JJ have been very explicit. Just go watch a crawl. The crawls in Star Wars tell you these people are evil, these people are good. We hope that the evil people don't win. And then, of course, like Rian Johnson comes in and goes like, actually, no, are those people totally evil and are those people totally good? Like, we should probably play with the gray. Let's play with that. And that's very much saying to the Star Wars mythology, like, let's explore that a little deeper. And I don't think that was what a lot of people expected. Some people loved it. A lot of my friends in the podcasting world loved it, but a lot of people also really hated that, especially traditionalists who were like, what are you doing with my Star Wars? Like, it's supposed to be good and evil, and you're like messing with all of this. So I think that it reflects the modern moviegoer's cultural and societal perspective, or more pointedly to your question, our headcanon about how the story should adapt over time. Should the story consistently be more traditional, or should the story actually move into a less traditional kind of look at things, and we should start to deconstruct what's there? And I think that, you had conservatives. This is what's really fascinating to me, because I watched videos about this. You had conservatives like the Ben Shapiro's of the world, who, like, he's not even like a Star Wars guy, but he's giving his perspective on Star Wars, because conservatives are like usually traditionalists. And so they're like, whoa, what are you doing to my Star Wars? Whereas like liberals are usually the people on the left are a lot more progressive, and they like to challenge the status quo. And so you saw a lot of, like, especially my podcaster friends who probably fit into a more liberal viewpoint being like, awesome, let's question the mythology, let's question these things, let's go back to deconstructing our favorite stories, and maybe building them into a world which I'm more familiar with today. And I think people got wrapped up in like why those things were happening, but it literally comes down to, in my opinion, tradition versus deconstructionism and building something new. And I do think that when you look at the MCU in comparison, and you look at the headcanon that we're dealing with the MCU, they just pretty much said, we're aiming towards the mass market. And when you aim towards the mass market, you do not try and mess with some of the things that have made the thing successful. You just go to what George Lucas was more playing with, which is like, what will everybody like, right? Like, what is everybody not going to have a problem with? And I think that the MCU has lived into that. Now, as a storyteller, I don't like that as much because I like to play with different aspects of stories where it's like maybe we should deconstruct that, or maybe we should play it not as safe over here and go for something a little bit more dark. Like my favorite MCU movie is Guardians of the Galaxy because I feel like it's the least safe. Maybe besides like Infinity War, those are two of the most unsafe ways of dealing with stories for the mass market, and yet we're very, very successful. So I think, like I said earlier, that's going to get a lot harder for the MCU as it moves into its next phase, because I think it's going to start getting into aspects of storytelling that may not meet the traditionalist sort of requirements, which are then mass market appeal, for both sides of the fence. So can the mass market deal with the new stories? Maybe if we don't challenge them as much and more just live into what they're expecting from us. But so I think that's kind of how headcanon can get in the way of, and I think that artists need to essentially understand who they're making the movies for. If you're making a $200 million movie or a $450 million movie like Infinity War, you are writing it and directing it and acting in it for the mass market. You cannot go into some niche and think you're going to do some kind of like interesting art house film. If you're going to do an art house film, that thing better cost like $15 million to $20 million to make. Very, very different kind of storytelling.
Yeah, that's true.
So anyways, that's kind of my take on it. What's your take?
I think looking at especially the gap between Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker, because I don't think the gap between Force Awakens and Last Jedi is all that harsh.
Right.
It's fairly linear. There's a little bit of a gap, sort of like between A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. Of wait, they just ended on this huge high. Why are we all running away now? But I mean, apart from that, they're really close to the point that like it's the same scene with Rey and Luke.
Yeah.
They filmed it together initially. Like it was all that is, same thing as Rogue One and A New Hope. There's all of 30 seconds between those two scenes.
Right.
But you have, I think, like you were saying, different ideologies going into it. I think it's really clear to see the headcanon that JJ had, and the headcanon that Rian Johnson had.
Yeah, totally.
And one of the things that, I do like the sequel trilogy. A lot of complaints came out after Force Awakens of, well, it's just A New Hope all over again. And yes, that's true to more than a small degree. And they're like, oh, they just did the trench run again. And the challenge that I would give people is how many trench runs have they actually done?
Right.
And my answer to that is 4. And the one in Rise of Skywalker, Force Awakens is actually the 4th trench one. You have one in A New Hope. You have one in with the Falcon in Return of the Jedi. Yep. You have one in with little Anakin in Phantom Menace.
Yeah.
And then you have the 4th one in Rise of Skywalker. So it's like, yes, it is another trench run, but that is a common theme. It's been done in 4 films now out of 6 or out of 7. Right. But I think and spoilers, if you have not seen the sequel trilogy, you have the ending of Last Jedi where Rey is nothing. And I think, and then in the first scene of Rise of Skywalker, they retcon it immediately. Which I think is part of what upset the people who liked The Last Jedi. It's like, well, what was all of that storytelling and narrative building for if we're just going to erase that and call it off as Kylo was just trying to trick Rey. It feels very cheap. But the whole Rey being no one, looking at Ryan Johnson's interpretation of the Force is very, very curious because it turns the entire Skywalker trilogy into focusing on two characters instead of one character. It's now focused on the Skywalkers as a collective character
Yeah.
and the Force as a collective character.
Right.
You have issues in the prequel trilogy of the fault of righteousness is hubris
Mm.
and the fault of power is greed.
Yes.
And you see the fault of hubris
Mm-hmm.
fail in the prequel trilogy.
Yeah.
You see the scales sort of reset with the end of the Return of the Jedi. There's not really any new establishment yet. Whereas the end of Revenge of the Sith, you definitely have the establishment of the Empire, and you see the new logos on things. And the First Galactic Empire. But to be honest, I think you see the pendulum shift the other way in the sequel trilogy, where it's really focused on the fault of power more than it is on the fault of hubris. Just looking at the narrative of the Force and the Jedi versus Sith, it's really more focused on Kylo Ren and Snoke and the Emperor. And at the end of it, you do find the balance in the prophecy, the Skywalkers who would bring balance, although it's not explicitly a Skywalker that does it, because when Rey turns on her lightsaber, it is neither blue, green, or red. It is an entirely new and neutral color, and so you don't have the core of the Force-wielding people pursuing either righteousness or power.
Right.
Which is where I think Ryan Johnson was probably trying to go with it.
Right.
And it sort of, I think, probably ended where Ryan Johnson wanted it to, but not in the method that Ryan Johnson wanted it to.
Right.
But
Yeah,
you
exactly.
see this battle between him and JJ of headcanon, what's, like you said, what Star Wars should be and what are you doing to my Star Wars?
Yep.
This week, I rewatched Rise of Skywalker and did it with an exercise of switching some of the details. And even looking at it of a point of, could it be edited now to be this story? And I think the short answer to that is yes. But looking at details of, what if you left Rey as a nobody? And then at the end, when she buries Luke and Leia's lightsabers, what if she just says, and the old woman says, "Who are you?" Rey, just Rey.
Yeah.
And left herself as a nobody, stepping out into that neutral role. The whole Emperor being back thing actually doesn't really bother me, because that fits, to me, Palpatine's character of, I've got all this cloning tech, probably should make a body double.
Right. Not to mention, when you kill Snoke, you need somebody that's more intimidating than Snoke. You do need to turn Kylo Ren into somebody more intimidating than Snoke. Or if you're not, so that would mean he doesn't get redeemed, because he would have to go full bad. Or you have to bring somebody else in and hopefully not introduce us to somebody complete. Like, if you ever read Colin Trevorrow's script, he tried to introduce a completely new villain in the third movie. And to me, that's a bad call, because now you're trying to get everyone to learn some new person who's supposed to be worse than Snoke was. Then why did you kill Snoke at all? So Palpatine almost like is the de facto. You have to go to I mean, I guess you could have brought back Vader, which doesn't feel right at all. But like so Palpatine is sort of like the best answer to this problem. So it kind of makes sense, like you're saying.
But yeah, so that was my little headcanon exercise as I was thinking about this question of like, okay, what does it look like to approach Rise of Skywalker? Because I usually don't do that. I try to let a film be a film. I try to let a book be a book, especially when it's a book franchise and a film franchise. I try to let them be their own things and try not to meld them, because I think the artist's voice and how they translate it to the film, or how they translate it into a book or a comic after the fact, is really important. Um, the artist is telling a story for a reason, and they're
Right.
telling it in a way for a reason. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. But it's interesting to see in that headcanon exercise how perhaps what Ryan had built in Last Jedi
Mm.
could have been carried over into the Rise of Skywalker we got.
Yeah, that's a good exercise because one of the things that, and it actually underlines my point that I'm making about the ideology. Because if the exercise were, sorry, if the sequel trilogy had not been the end of the Skywalker saga, which is what it was marketed it as. Like, it seems like Ryan Johnson was basically like, the end of the Skywalker saga is significant because we need to move away from Skywalkers and we need to make everybody can be a Jedi type of thing, right? Like, anybody has the potential and possibility of being a Jedi. And it looked like what J.J. Abrams' headcanon was like, no, this is the end of the Skywalker saga. So at the end of this, we should want to root for Skywalkers. Whereas I think J.J. Abrams or Ryan Johnson was more like, no, at the end of this, anybody should be able to be a Force user. And so yeah, you can make that change to your story, and it sort of underlines the different headcanons running that perspective. Like, we know we need to end on Skywalker. No, does not end on Skywalker. And like, those are the two battles that are
Yeah,
wrestling.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Well, and I think you see that at the end of Last Jedi when the kid moves the broom.
exactly.
You start to see more sensitivity to the Force coming back to the world,
Yeah,
but which also then weirdly JJ brings in, I think, in Rise of Skywalker with what Finn's trying to tell Rey.
totally.
So it's weird to end up in the same place with two very different headcanons on what Star Wars should be and two very different ideologies being brought into it.
Well, and to that point, I think that was JJ's plan from the beginning. Because if you go back and rewatch The Force Awakens now, you'll see that there's iconography that would suggest that Finn is going to become a Jedi, right?
Yes,
Like,
no, absolutely.
yeah,
Everybody thought that from the first poster with him having it in the
exactly.
trailer.
Exactly. And then in The Last Jedi, Ryan Johnson, and probably because he'd been given so many characters and so many things to do things with, was like, yeah, we're going to basically send Finn on a totally different path. He's not going to be anything resembling a Jedi whatsoever. And then it was like J.J. Abrams coming back and going like, well, I kind of wanted him to be a Jedi. So what's going on here? So it just, those are some distinct differences in you know, the again, the headcanon, the ideology that's driving the stories is a deconstructionist. It's kind of interesting to me because I think that J.J. Abrams, while he was being a traditionalist, I think that he thought he was being fairly liberal in his approach. What I mean by liberal is progressive of Star Wars. Like, I'm going to end the Star Wars trilogy, the sequel trilogy. I'm going to end it with a female Jedi and with a black Jedi. Like we've not seen that before, and he thought he was being progressive in that area. But what happened was Ryan Johnson went, yeah, but actually, I'm going to deconstruct the entire framework by which
Of
we
the
would
Jedi,
judge
yeah.
a Jedi. And then that kind of made J.J. Abrams go like, well, now what am I going to do in the third one? Like, so it really, again, this is what happens without a consistent visionary at the head going like, no, this is actually where you need to, these are the things to poke holes in as we make this sequel trilogy. Not don't poke those holes and those holes because we were not going to recover from that.
There's too many holes.
Yeah, and again, this is not me critiquing this series because I dislike it. I'm just critiquing it from a storytelling standpoint, going like, why doesn't it feel as cohesive as the MCU feels?
Well, and with the end of this Skywalker saga, I really hope, at least in the film capacity, I really hope we get, and I think the ideal medium would be comics, but more on Rey, I think, again, based on her lightsaber color, not pursuing light or dark necessarily,
right?
But also then bringing in Finn, perhaps some of those other stormtroopers into the story of being connected with the Force, but not in a pursuit of either power or righteousness.
Yeah.
would be I think a very interesting comic franchise to push through.
Yeah, and the one thing I will say that the sequel trilogy does in an exemplary way is that Rey, Finn, Poe, and Kylo, all four of those characters are characters that are so good that they can appear in comics. You could do movies about them. You could do entire movies about them, and each one of them would be compelling in their own way. So yeah,
Absolutely.
I think you're right. I think they've got plenty to work with. In fact, right now, honestly, I would rather be going into storytelling on the Star Wars side than the MCU side. Because the MCU side, how do you mess with that?
Yeah,
how do you mess with what came before it? Whereas Star Wars is like, well, it's gotten a little rocky. The fandom's gotten a little divisive. So now it's a good place to bring in new stories. Whereas the MCU is almost like, how do you go higher? that's
well,
a tough one.
And with the MCU, each film progressively made has to account for every single film before it.
Exactly.
They can't cross any of those wires. And so each film at this point has more things to keep track of. And
Yes.
with Star Wars, they ended the Skywalker saga.
Exactly.
Yes, the fan base, like you said, is divided, but it's a clean slate.
Yeah. Which is why Mandalorian works so well.
Is off to a great start.
Exactly.
It is telling a very authentic parallel story that is its own thing, but being very, very true to the systems and the tropes of the Empire and the New Republic.
Yep.
And the crime world of Star Wars. And there's a number of things coming. Taika has a trilogy, which is weird because they have said we're not necessarily doing trilogies. And maybe Taika will tell 3 individual stories, which might be a really nice change to Star Wars. And just he's going to sort of enact and set off the Star Wars equivalents to Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor. But I agree with you that I think that this is a really good starting point for Star Wars to grow from.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think The Mandalorian is the first sort of evidence and iteration of that growth.
Totally agree.
Thank you. Unless you have any other final comments or questions, Jay or anyone in the chat, that is it for today's show. Please make sure that you subscribe to this channel if you would like to get more geek content, and be sure you have that bell turned on so that you get all of our notifications when we have shows going live. We will see you on the next show in a couple weeks. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. We love having you here. Have a wonderful weekend.